Yo guys, it's Matt here and welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to be talking about how to loop some of the greatest loops in the game. We're not going to be going on every map, but we're going to go on some of the very OP maps, and I'm going to be talking about how to loop some of the very good loops that are on those maps, as the Shack and on Hawkins for example. As you can see here, we're starting off on the Shack, and I want to show here that you should always loop the Shack from this angle, because that's how you always get a fast vault on the window. I see a lot of survivors looping it from the other side, because then they have the Killer Shack pallet ready to drop. But you should never really drop the Killer Shack pallet unless you're 100% going down and you might be on death hook. And as you see here, after I vaulted the window 3 times, it got blocked off, and now I can't vault it again for a long time. And that resulted in me getting stuck inside the Shack with Myers now, and I can either drop the pallet, which I don't want to, or I can take a hit. Now onto this next loop. This is kind of just a standard loop that you found on Autoheaven and some other maps, where there's 2 long sides to a pallet and then the pallet in the middle. No window close or anything, just a pallet. These loops are typically the one that can be very good, especially if the killer doubles backs once or twice when you're circling around. And you can usually get 1 or 2 loops around each side. But with these loops you should not try to greed them too much, because it's a very strong and safe pallet. The killer literally has to kick it. And as you see on screen here, I dropped the pallet, and a little tip here is run a bit forward and then run a bit back and drop the pallet, because then the killer thinks you're not gonna drop the pallet, but you are. So it's a pretty good mind game. Onto the fun boss now. There are 2 variations of this, where the window is either blocked or open. And the window I refer to is the one that's on screen right now, because that's a very safe window. The killer literally has to go the whole way around, which is very far, or they have to vault it, which is very slow. And as you see here, there's also a fairly unsafe pallet at this loop. So how to loop this motherfucker? You should always try to go for a fast vault at the window, because then you're going to make a lot of distance on the killer, and that's very important at this loop, because then you can get the golden 3 loops around the window. And if necessary, if you messed up as I did in this clip and ran the wrong way, you can always drop the pallet. And if you want, you can always try to blind the killer while they kick the pallet and then lose them, because they obviously can't see shit if they're blind. Now onto this next loop. It's a pretty standard one as well. I don't really know what to call it, so I'm just gonna call it the long wall, short wall loop. This loop really depends on how much distance you have on the killer. If you have a lot of distance, then the loop can be pretty good, but it's usually pretty bad. So don't try to run the killer for too long on this one. And now we have what I would call a standard jungle gym, where you have a pallet and a window. If you have this one where the window is on the long wall, then it's the better variation of the loop in my opinion, and you can maybe loop that long wall once or twice. And if you don't feel like running the window again, you can always run to the pallet, which is pretty safe. And this is pretty much the jungle gym where you can run the killer for ages if you know what you're doing and you have a bit of a boosted killer. And now this loop is kind of one of the more unsafes on Autoheaven, because this pallet is really unsafe. You should never loop it like I do right now, because this is a long wall to walk around. And if you loop it the other way, then it's a very small way to run around, so the killer can easily mind game you on there. Now it doesn't really matter if you run the long or the short way around this pallet. You're probably going to take a hit either way, unless you have dead hard. But there is this window, so I guess it got that going for it. Now onto the next loop. This is pretty much one of the most common loops in the game, and it's widely known as the TNL wall, because it's shaped like a T and L. If you know what you're doing here, you might be able to get 3 walls on both windows, but that's very unlikely, because they usually end up being a lot of mind games on these TNL walls. The killer usually ends up doubling back a lot, and that can either fuck them up or secure it down for them. Sometimes this loop can be very good, but it can also be very bad if you go against a killer that knows how to mind game and know what they're doing. So try to identify what killer you're going against, and if it's a good one, try to avoid these TNL walls. But a lot of people don't know how to loop this, so here's a picture of how to loop it. And now onto the crane. This is a pretty underrated loop actually. A lot of new players don't know how good this loop actually is, but the window of this loop is pretty much a god window. You don't even have to be good to get 3 loops out of this. It's pretty much just vault, jump down and go whatever way you want to. It's also very easy to mind game here, because the killer can't look down when they vault, so you can pretty much just go whatever way you want, because the killer can't see you while they vault. And there's also a pretty safe pallet here. Now onto another map. We have Haddonfield, and there's these parked cars in the middle of the street with a pallet, and they're mostly kind of safe. You can probably get 1 or 2 loops out of them. You're very lucky if you get 3 loops out of this, but try to keep it under 2 and don't greed the pallet, because there's a lot of people that greed pallets, and it's not always worth it to greed pallets. Then we have this house. Oh boy, probably one of the greatest loops in the whole game. Especially if this window right here is open. It's so strong, and you can vault it, go back downstairs, go up the stairs again, vault it, go back downstairs, go up the stairs and vault the window again. You can almost always get 3 loops out of this. And if you don't, you have a pallet down there as well. The amount of killers that's left me as soon as they saw me run into this place is just mental. Haddonfield is widely known in the community as one of the best survivor maps, and there is almost no unsafe pallets here. The pallet you just saw me throw down is probably one of the unsafest pallets on this map, but it's still pretty safe compared to other pallets on other maps. Now this pallet right here is kind of the equivalent to the one that I showed you on Autoheaven with the 2 trucks. This loop is also very safe because you have these 2 long benches and you can probably run around each bench twice or maybe 3 times. And as you see here, my friend actually lost me because there are these 2 tall trees and a big rock, so it's kind of easy to lose line of sight with the killer. Yeah, this loop is pretty strong, so if you're here, you're pretty safe. You can just see how many times I ran around each side before I had to drop the pallet. Now, if the killer don't kick this one, then it's a pretty safe pallet and you can probably get even more loops in around this pallet. One tip I will say is, if a pallet is dropped like this, you should probably try to figure out if the killer mind games a lot or not. If you come to the conclusion that the killer does mind game, then maybe try to fake the pallet once or twice to like get even more distance, because then the killer will double back. What I mean by faking a pallet is that you run to the pallet and then pretend like you're gonna vault, but don't vault, and then keep running the way around. You can also do this with windows. But don't stay at a drop pallet for too long, because eventually the killer will bloodlust you and down you. Now this loop is also very good. You can probably loop the killer here for like 30 seconds or even a minute if you get the ultimate use out of it. You should just kind of choose one of the sides to loop around depending on how much distance you have the killer, and then try to get at least 2 times around, maybe even 3 times if you have the distance. Generally all the loops of this map is pretty good, so when you load into this map, just have in mind that you could probably loop the killer for once or twice on every loop, depending on how much distance you have on the killer, of course. Now moving on to the houses. The houses on these maps are very good. They usually have some very strong windows on them, and you can often use them to get a lot of distance on the killer. But try not running into a dead end like I am here, because then you're gonna die. But always try to locate a window when you enter it, because it might be your safest way out. And if you manage to get a fast vault on the window, then you can probably get a lot of distance on the killer, especially if you have balanced landing. Now moving on at the Maya's house. This is probably the best loop at this map location, and it's probably like the shack at Haddonfield. If the downstairs window isn't open, then there's probably 2 good windows at the top with 2 balconies, as you see on screen right now, and you can use those windows to mind game the killer a lot. And when you drop down, you can probably run inside the house again, upstairs, and vault the window again, and do that 2 times perhaps. Now moving on to Hawkins. It's known as one of the worst survivor maps, but it actually does have one of the best loops in the game. And it's the room I'm in right now, where the 2 stairs run up and there's 2 windows on each side at the end of the room and 2 pallets downstairs. If you have a lot of distance on the killer, you can probably run the killer here for a few minutes. And also this map is probably one of the best for balanced landing, so if you did bring that, you're lucky, because you can run the killer here for even more minutes with balanced landing. And there tends to be a lot of mind games on this loop where the killer would double back if he sees you trying to vault the window. So maybe try to not vault and just fake it like I told you to earlier, because then you will have a lot of distance on the killer once again. And as you saw there, I faked the window and Myers dropped down, so now he has to go all the way upstairs again, and I can go to the next window and try to mind game him once again. And if you can't make the window, you can jump off the side here as I just did and try to make the pallet. And if you manage to do that, you can run the killer even longer. Now I want to showcase a room that can be very unsafe. This is the room with the stairs and with the window. And if you vault that window, you go directly down to the stairs and almost always takes a hit. The only way you can really want the killer for a long time if he keeps doubling back and you keep doubling back as shown in the clip. And then you can pretty much be here forever, but that never happens. So you're probably dead if you enter this room. And if you decide to vault the window, you might be able to make it to the pallet. And if you get a stun there, you could make a little bit of distance and get into the next room, which is also a fairly unsafe room. This is kind of like the previous room with 1 window, but now there's 2 stairs, so it's even more unsafe. And the pallet is even more unsafe. So if you enter this room, you're pretty much dead 90% of the time, so try to avoid this room. And now for the last loop of this video, it's the upside down. This loop is probably one of the more safe loops to do a generator on, because you have a lot of time to see if the killer's coming. But when you start that chase, it's not that safe anymore. Pretty much every loop with a drop down on it is bad for survivors, because survivors get a staggered effect and the killer doesn't, so the killer will catch up on you if you drop down. You'll probably only be able to get 1 loop in here, and you have to drop down to the window to get to a pallet. But the pallet here is also fairly unsafe. So what to take away from this map is that if you go to the middle room, then you're fucking set for life. You can run the killer there forever. But if you go to any other room, you're pretty much fucked. So yeah, that's gonna do it for today's video. It might not even seem like it, but it took a lot of time to put this video together. So if you could leave a like on the video to get it out to more people, I would really appreciate it. And please subscribe if you're new here. You can always unsubscribe if you get bored of the content. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face. Tell me that you love me.